It was a warm, sunny Saturday afternoon in Oak Ridge Heights, the kind of day that demanded a backyard barbecue. The Parker family, who had recently moved into the neighborhood, decided it was the perfect opportunity to introduce themselves to their new neighbors. Jason Parker, a tall, proud black man in his early 40s, stood by the grill flipping burgers with an easygoing smile. His wife, Lisa, was laughing with a group of friends, and their kids, Zoe and Marcus, were chasing each other around with water balloons, their giggles echoing through the yard. The smell of ribs and burgers filled the air, blending with the sounds of lively conversation and easy laughter. A small group of family friends had joined them, lounging around the picnic tables. Music played softly in the background, setting a relaxed summer vibe. The Parkers were excited to be here, hoping this would mark the beginning of new friendships and good memories in their suburban paradise. But just a few houses down, trouble was brewing behind a curtain of lace. Mrs. Caldwell, a longtime resident of Oak Ridge Heights and self-appointed neighborhood watch, stood at her window, arms crossed tightly across her chest. She glared through the glass, her face twisted in disapproval as she watched the Parkers barbecue from afar. She hadn't liked them from the moment they moved in. It wasn't anything they'd done. No, she just had an idea in her head about those kinds of people. And today, watching the Parkers' backyard fill with guests, she had reached her breaking point. She squinted, trying to make out the faces of the people in the yard, counting them. "That's too many," she muttered to herself. "There's no way they're keeping it quiet. And the music, it's just too loud." Mrs. Caldwell, fuming, picked up her phone and dialed 911. Her voice was tight and irritated as she spoke to the dispatcher. "There's a large group of people in my neighborhood having a loud party," she said. "It looks like it could get out of control. You need to send someone over to check it out." The dispatcher assured her that an officer would be sent, and Mrs. Caldwell hung up, satisfied. She peered out the window again, her lips curling into a smug smile. "That'll show them," she thought, stepping back into the shadows of her quiet, empty living room. Back at the barbecue, Jason was oblivious to the brewing storm. He glanced over at Lisa, who was laughing at a joke one of their friends had just told. The kids were happily spraying each other with a hose now, squealing with joy. Everything felt perfect, like they had finally found their home. Suddenly, a murmur rippled through the group. Jason turned to see what had caught everyone's attention, and his eyes landed on a police car slowly pulling up to the curb. The flashing lights weren't on, but the sight of it alone was enough to make the air grow heavy with tension. Conversations died down and people exchanged uneasy glances. Jason's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his cool. He wiped his hands on a towel and stepped forward, watching as a uniformed officer got out of the car and made his way up the driveway. "Good afternoon, sir," the officer said, his tone neutral. "We got a call about a noise complaint and a gathering that might be out of control. Just need to check things out." Jason raised an eyebrow, glancing around at the peaceful scene in his backyard. There were maybe a dozen people at most. The kids were playing, the music wasn't even close to loud, and the only thing out of control was how perfectly the ribs were grilling. "No problem, officer," Jason said, his voice steady but calm. "Just a family barbecue. Everything's under control." Before the officer could respond, a sharp voice interrupted. Mrs. Caldwell had appeared at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, glaring at Jason and the group like she was a queen overseeing her disobedient subjects. "I told you," she called out, her voice dripping with disdain. "Look at this. There are too many people, too much noise. They don't care about the neighborhood. This is unacceptable." The officer turned to look at her, clearly unimpressed with her outburst. He glanced back at Jason, and Jason could see the situation hanging in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. It was like waiting for the pin to drop. Jason's easygoing smile faded, but before he could say anything, the officer's posture changed. He straightened, his expression shifting from neutral to sharp and professional. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice taking on a commanding tone, "I suggest you lower your voice and calm down. This gentleman right here is Captain Jason Parker, the new police captain for our precinct." Mrs. Caldwell froze. Her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to process what she had just heard. She stared at Jason as if seeing him for the first time, her earlier smugness dissolving into shock and embarrassment. Jason didn't move, didn't speak. He just crossed his arms, his steady gaze fixed on Mrs. Caldwell as he waited. The tension was thick in the air, every guest at the barbecue watching, holding their breath. The officer turned back to Jason, offering a small but respectful nod. Captain Parker, there's no issue here. You're well within your rights. I'll clear this up. Mrs. Caldwell's face flushed red, her eyes darting between Jason and the officer, searching for something to say but finding nothing. She stammered, I didn't realize. I didn't mean to. Jason tilted his head slightly, his voice calm and controlled. It's all right, ma'am. But next time, maybe come talk to us directly if you have any concerns. We're your neighbors after all. The officer glanced at Mrs. Caldwell, his patience clearly thinning. Ma'am, there's nothing wrong here. Please head back inside and enjoy your afternoon. With that, Mrs. Caldwell turned and scurried back toward her house, her earlier bravado reduced to a humiliated retreat. She didn't look back. As she disappeared into her home, the tension broke like a wave crashing into shore. The Parkers' friends started to relax again, smiles creeping back onto their faces. The kids resumed their game and the smell of grilled food once again filled the air. Jason shook his head, laughing softly as he turned back to the grill. Lisa walked over, a grin on her face. Well, she said, that's one way to make an introduction. Jason smirked, picking up a spatula. Guess the neighborhood knows who's in charge now, he said with a wink. And with that, the Parker family's barbecue continued, even sweeter now after the storm had passed.